The rider did not dismount. He sat there on his black horse in the September dust, looking down at Elspeth Ellsworth like she was already something buried. His gold watch chain caught the afternoon sun. His mutton-chop whiskers were combed neat as Sunday. And his voice, when it came, was almost kind. "For cents a bushel, Mrs. Ellsworth. That's my final offer." Behind Elspeth, two small hands clutched her apron. Caleb, 8 years old, standing straight the way his father used to stand. Unia, 5, hiding her face in the calico folds. Inside the barn behind them sat 500 bushels of corn. Golden, dried, stacked to the rafters. Every kernel earned by a woman, who had buried her husband in March and pulled a plow through Kansas soil with her own 2 hands. For cents a bushel, Cyrus Blackwood knew exactly what he was doing. He knew about the loan at the bank. He knew about the taxes coming due. He knew a widow with 2 mouths to feed, and no man in the house had nowhere left to turn. What he did not know, what he could not have known on that dusty September afternoon in 1875, was that a black woman named Ophelia Freeman lived 3 miles down the creek. And Ophelia knew something about corn that Cyrus Blackwood did not. First, the offer. First, the silence. First, the way Elspeth Ellsworth stood there in her patched calico dress and did the arithmetic in her head. 500 bushels, for cents each, $20. $20 against 100, and 80 owed to the bank. $20 against seed for next spring. $20 against boots for Caleb, who had outgrown his last pair in June. $20 against the taxes due in November. $20 was nothing. $20 was a joke. $20 was a man on a black horse telling a widow she was already dead, and just didn't know it yet. Elspeth looked up at him. Her gray eyes did not blink. "No." Blackwood smiled. Not a real smile. The kind of smile a man gives a child who has said something charming and stupid at the same time. "No? No, Mr. Blackwood. I will not sell my corn for 4 cents a bushel." He leaned forward in the saddle. The leather creaked. "Then don't sell it. Keep it. Let it sit in that barn until the mice get fat and the mold sets in. Let it rot right there on your husband's land." He paused. He wanted her to hear the next part. "And come April, when the sheriff nails the auction notice to your gate, I will buy this land for less than what I offered you today. Every acre, every stick, every kernel of corn still moldering in your barn." Unia whimpered into the calico. Caleb did not move. Elspeth did not move either. "Good day, Mr. Blackwood." He tipped his hat. He turned the horse. He rode away in a slow, easy trot like a man who had all the time in the world because he did. Elspeth watched him go until the dust settled. Then she turned. She knelt down in the dirt. She looked at her 2 children, with a face she made steady on purpose. "Inside, both of you. Wash your hands. Unia, help your brother pump the water." "Mama," Caleb started. Inside. They went. And Elspeth Ellsworth, 32 years old, widow of Jedediah Ellsworth, mother of 2, owner of 160 acres of Kansas prairie, and 500 bushels of worthless corn, walked into her barn and closed the door behind her and put her hands over her face. She had promised herself. She had promised herself in March, standing at Jedediah's grave, with Caleb holding one hand and Unia holding the other, that the children would never see her cry. Not once. Not ever. She had kept that promise for 6 months. She kept it now. Jedediah had been coughing since November. First it was nothing. Tickle. A man clearing his throat by the fire on cold evenings. Elspeth had made him tea with honey and rubbed goose fat on his chest, and told him he worked too hard. He had laughed. He had said a man who worked too hard was a man who fed his children. By Christmas the cough had teeth. By January it had blood. By February Miss Ophelia Freeman was walking 3 miles up the creek every other day, bringing willow bark and mullein leaf and a bitter dark syrup she made, from a recipe her mother had carried out of Georgia. She would sit by Jedediah's bed and hum low under her breath, songs Elspeth did not know, songs from a place Elspeth had never been. Jedediah would close his eyes and listen. Sometimes he would smile. Ophelia never took payment. When Elspeth pressed a coin into her hand one afternoon, the old woman closed Elspeth's fingers back around it. "Child, your husband is dying. I am not going to charge you for keeping him company on the road." Jedediah died on the 14th of March, 1875. The ground was still half frozen. Elspeth built the coffin herself out of pine boards from the woodshed because the town carpenter wanted $8, and she did not have $8. Caleb held the nails. Unia sat on the floor and sang a song about lambs that her mother had taught her, though she did not understand, yet that her father was inside the box her mother was building. They buried Jedediah on a rise behind the house, where the wild plum trees grew. Miss Ophelia came. The Reverend came. 2 neighbors came. That was all. The wind was cold. The Reverend said words. Elspeth stood with her children and kept her face empty. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with Jedediah's ledger book and understood for the first time how much trouble she was in. The bank in town had loaned Jedediah $200 in December to buy medicine. The note came due April 1876. Interest was 8%. She turned the page. There was more. Seed loans. Payment on the plow. Taxes. She closed the book. She sat in the dark. She could hear Unia breathing in the little bed by the stove. She thought, "I have 13 months." She thought, "I have 5 acres cleared and 8 acres to break and no man to help me." She thought, "I have 2 children and no husband and 1 mule and a plow that leans to the left." Then she thought, and this was the important part, this was the thing that saved her, "I have 13 months, and I am not going to waste one of them feeling sorry for myself." She stood up. She banked the fire. She went to bed. In the morning she woke Caleb before dawn and told him he was going to lead the mule for her. He was 7 at the time. He nodded like a man being given orders. He put on his boots. He went outside. That was the spring Elspeth Ellsworth broke 5 new acres of Kansas prairie, with a plow that leaned to the left, a mule that hated her, a 7-year-old boy who could barely reach the mule's bridle, and a 5-year-old girl who carried water back and forth from the pump all day without complaining once. By June they had planted corn. By August the corn was tall, taller than Caleb, taller than the plow handles, green and thick and reaching for the sky. And then, on the 12th of August, the grasshoppers came. They came in a cloud so thick it darkened the sun. A cloud that made a sound like 1,000 tiny scissors all cutting at once. The old-timers said they had seen it before in '74, but never like this. Never so many. Never so hungry. They ate everything. They ate the wheat in the field, and the beans in the garden, and the leaves off the trees, and the shirts drying on the line. They ate the paint off wagon wheels. They ate the handles of shovels left out in the yard. A woman 2 farms over lost her sunbonnet off her own head while she was trying to run inside. They ate half of Kansas in 3 days. Elspeth stood on her porch with the children pressed against her legs and watched the cloud pass over her land, and by some grace she could not explain and did not question, the cloud went around. Her farm sat in a shallow valley. The wind that day came from the north, hard and steady, and it lifted the grasshopper cloud up over the ridge and carried it south, and the swarm never dropped down into her fields at all. When the sky cleared 3 days later, her corn was still standing. Tall, green, untouched. Every farm around her was black, stripped, ruined. She was the only one for 6 miles with a crop. At first this seemed like a miracle. Elspeth got down on her knees in the parlor that night with Caleb and Unia and thanked God. And Unia asked why God had eaten everyone else's corn, but not theirs, and Elspeth did not have a good answer, so she said God's ways were not our ways and put the children to bed. She should have known. She should have known that when a widow with a dead husband and a bank loan is the only person for 6 miles with a crop, that is not a miracle. That is a target. The men came in September. They came in wagons, on horseback, on foot. Buyers from Topeka. Buyers from Kansas City. Buyers from as far east as St. Louis. Word travels fast, when grasshoppers eat a state, and word travels faster, when there is one widow with 500 bushels of corn, and no man to negotiate for her. The first one offered 12 cents. Elspeth said no. The second one offered 9. Elspeth said no. The third one, a fat man, with a Missouri accent, and a wet lower lip, offered 7 cents, and told her she was being unreasonable. Elspeth pointed at the road, and told him to use it. By the middle of September the price had collapsed. Every farmer in the state who had saved a crop was trying to sell at once. Buyers knew it. Buyers were kings. The price fell to 5 cents. Then to 4. Then Cyrus Blackwood rode up on his black horse, and did not dismount, and offered 4 cents like it was a gift. But Cyrus Blackwood was not just another buyer. Cyrus Blackwood was on the board of the First Bank of Prairie Grove, the same bank that held Jedediah Ellsworth's $200 note. Elspeth did not know this yet. She knew Blackwood was rich. She knew he owned land all over the county, land he had bought at sheriff's auctions, from families who had gone bust in the Panic of '73, land he rented back to the same families at rates that guaranteed they would go bust again next year. She knew he was the kind of man who wore a gold watch chain to a widow's barn. She did not know, sitting at her kitchen table, that night with the ledger open, that the man who had ridden up to buy her corn was the same man who held her mortgage. She figured it out the next morning. She was cleaning the stove, not because it needed cleaning, because her hands needed to be doing something. Because if her hands were still, she would start thinking about the $20, and if she thought about the $20, she would start thinking about April, and if she started thinking about April, she would break. So she cleaned the stove, and while she cleaned, she thought about Blackwood's face. The way he had said the words sheriff's auction like he was reading them off a piece of paper he had already written. Like he knew. Like he already knew. Her hand stopped. She stood up. She wiped her fingers on her apron. She walked to the shelf where Jedediah's ledger sat, and she opened it to the page with the bank loan, and she read the names at the bottom of the note. First Bank of Prairie Grove. Officers J. Whitfield, President. H. Marsh, Cashier. C. Blackwood, Director. C. Blackwood. Cyrus Blackwood. Elspeth sat down on the kitchen chair very slowly. She put the ledger on her lap. She stared at the name. He was not just trying to buy her corn cheap. He was trying to make sure she could not pay her loan. He was trying to force the default. He was trying to make the sheriff's auction happen. Because when the auction came, he would be the highest bidder. He would be the only bidder. He would take the 160 acres of Good Creek Bottom, Kansas farmland that Jedediah Ellsworth had died working, and he would take it for less than the price of a decent horse. Elspeth sat there for a long time. Unia came in from outside. Unia had a wildflower in her fist. Unia held it up. "Mama, for you." Elspeth looked at her daughter. She took the flower. She smiled. It was the kind of smile a woman puts on the way she puts on a bonnet from the outside in. "Thank you, sweet pea. It's beautiful. Put it in the blue cup on the shelf." Unia trotted off. Elspeth stared at the wall. 13 months had become 7. That was the night Caleb heard her. She had been so careful. 6 months of steady voice, and dry eyes, and a straight back. She had cried only in the barn, only with the door closed, only into her own hands. But that night the weight of it broke her. She was in bed. The children were asleep on the other side of the room, curled together under the quilt she had sewn from Jedediah's old shirts. The wind was moving in the eaves, and she was thinking about her husband, and the loan, and Blackwood's smile, and the way the sheriff would look when he read the notice, and she started to cry. She tried to be quiet. She was not quiet enough. In the morning, before dawn, Caleb was standing at the foot of her bed, fully dressed, boots on. His face was the small, serious face of a boy who has decided something in the night. "Mama." Elspeth sat up. "You're up early. I heard you." She did not say anything. "You were crying." "I was." He nodded. He did not look away. "Is it because of the corn man?" "It is." "Is he going to take our farm?" Elspeth pushed the quilt back. She put her feet on the cold floor. She looked at her son, who was 8 years old, and standing there like he had grown 4 inches in the dark. He is going to try. Are we going to let him? No. How? She did not have an answer. That was the truth. She did not have one single answer. What she had was a barn full of corn nobody wanted, and a bank note she could not pay, and a Missouri winter coming, and 2 children who trusted her. But Caleb was waiting. Caleb needed something, so she said the only true thing she could think of. I don't know yet, Caleb, but I am going to find out. Today. I am going to go find out today. He nodded. He turned. He walked toward the door. He stopped. He turned back. Mama. Yes. I will work. Just tell me what to do. Like Papa. He said it flat, without drama, the way a man states a fact about weather. Then he opened the door and went out to feed the mule. Elspeth sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands against her mouth. She left the children with the Kaufman girl next farm over and she walked. She walked 3 miles down the creek, along a path she had walked 100 times. When Jedediah was dying, a path where the cottonwoods leaned in, over the water, and the crickets started their afternoon song too early because they could feel autumn in the wind. She walked to Miss Ophelia Freeman's cabin. It sat in a clearing where the creek made a wide bend. It was not much to look at from the outside. Small, rough-cut boards, a tin chimney, a stack of firewood that was too big for one woman alone, but that Ophelia had cut herself, every stick, because she had learned young that no one else was going to do it for her. The door was open. It usually was in September before the cold set in. Miss Ophelia, it's Elspeth. Come in, child. I was wondering when you'd get here. Elspeth stopped at the threshold. She had been inside this cabin before, many times, when Jedediah was sick. When Ophelia had needed help hauling water, after her hip went bad in July. She had been in and out of this cabin all year, but she had never looked up. She looked up now. The ceiling of Miss Ophelia Freeman's cabin was gold. Every rafter, every joist, every inch of the wooden underside of the roof was hung with dried ears of corn. Rows and rows of them, braided together at the husks, and hung down like a curtain. Some of the braids were fat and yellow and new. Some were old and dark, the kernels almost brown. The ears were packed so close together that the wood behind them barely showed. It looked like a treasure vault. It looked like a church. It looked like the inside of a place where something holy had been decided a long time ago. Elspeth stood in the doorway with her mouth open. Miss Ophelia. What? Sit down, child. But what is? Sit down. Elspeth sat. Ophelia moved around the small cabin the way she always moved, slow and deliberate, favoring the bad hip. She poured hot water into a chipped china cup. She dropped in a pinch of something dried and brown. She set it in front of Elspeth. She sat down across the little table. Drink, then we'll talk. Elspeth drank. It was bitter. It was warm. Tasted like the inside of a forest. Now, Ophelia said, you come here because you got trouble. Tell me what kind. So Elspeth told her. About Blackwood. About the 4 cents. About the bank note. About the name at the bottom of the ledger. About the $20 against the 200 owed. About the sheriff's auction in April. About the wind at night and the taste of it. About Caleb standing at the foot of her bed. Ophelia listened without moving. Her hands rested folded on the table. Her dark eyes did not leave Elspeth's face. When Elspeth ran out of words, Ophelia was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up, not at Elspeth, at the ceiling. You see my corn, child? Yes, ma'am. You know what it's doing up there? Drying, I guess. Storing. That too. But that's not the main thing. Elspeth waited. That corn is keeping me alive. I don't. Keeping me warm. Elspeth looked up again at the great gold ceiling. She looked back at Ophelia. I don't understand. Ophelia leaned forward. Her voice went soft, the way it did when she was telling something true. When I was a girl, Down in Georgia, on the Weatherly place, the big house had corn cribs built right into the walls of the upper story. The master's house, not for eating, for keeping cool in summer. Corn traps air, you see. Little pockets of air between the kernels. Thousands and thousands of little pockets. Air don't move through it easy. Heat don't move through it easy. She paused. She let it sit. They built those cribs to keep the house cool in Georgia summers. Yes, ma'am. But I noticed something. I was in the house one winter cleaning, and I noticed the upstairs was warmer than the downstairs. In January, everybody knows heat rises. Downstairs should be colder. But it wasn't. The corn was holding the warm air in. Same way it held the hot air out in summer. Backwards, but the same. You understand? Elspeth was still looking at her. You mean? I mean the master didn't know what he had. He built those cribs for one thing, but they did too. Ophelia sat back. Freed people knowledge, child. The people who own the land don't never need to learn how the land works. That's for the rest of us. Elspeth's mouth was dry. You put your corn in the ceiling. Every year for 30 years. To stay warm. To stay warm. And to eat. Come spring, when the weather turn, I take down the oldest braids and I grind them into meal. I got food and I got warmth in the same package. And I didn't pay for either one. Elspeth stared. 500 bushels, she whispered. That's a lot of corn. That's a lot of ceiling. You got a ceiling, don't you? I have a sod house with a wooden ceiling and a little attic. How big? Small. Maybe 3 feet at the peak. How thick the joists? Cottonwood. Not thick. Ophelia nodded slowly. You're gonna have to reinforce them. 12,000 pounds of corn on a ceiling built for a little bit of sod is asking for a bad morning. Elspeth's hands were shaking. She put them flat on the table so they would stop. Miss Ophelia. Yes, child. If I do this, if I put every kernel I have in the ceiling, and it works, I stay warm all winter. I eat corn in the spring. She paused. She had to say it out loud to make sure it was real. In May, when the wagons come through again, corn is going to be worth $1 a bushel. Maybe more. I could sell what I don't eat. You could. I could pay the bank. You could. I could keep the farm. You could. Elspeth looked up at the ceiling of Miss Ophelia's cabin one more time. Rows of gold. Kernels packed tight. 30 years of surviving hanging over one woman's head. Miss Ophelia, why are you telling me this? You don't owe me anything. I never did anything for you. Ophelia was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. It was a small smile. It was not for Elspeth. It was for something a long time ago. Child, when I was 7 years old, I watched my mama get sold away from me on a courthouse step in Macon, Georgia. She turned around before they put her in the wagon, and she looked at me and she said one thing. She said, "Baby, when you know something that can save somebody, you tell them. You tell them before they ask." Ophelia looked down at her folded hands. My mama has been dead 56 years, but I still do what she told me. Elspeth could not speak. Ophelia stood up, slowly on the bad hip. She went to the shelf. She took down a small cloth bag. She brought it back and set it on the table in front of Elspeth. Corn silk, willow bark, and a little of the dark syrup. In case one of your babies takes sick. You come back if you need more. You come back anyway. Elspeth stood up. She could not think of anything big enough to say, so she said the small thing. Thank you. You go home now, child. You got work to do. Elspeth walked home along the creek in the last of the afternoon light. The cottonwoods were starting to turn. The water ran low and clear over stones the color of old bone. Somewhere upstream a red-winged blackbird was calling. She walked slow. She was thinking. She was thinking about the ceiling of her house. She was thinking about the cottonwood joists Jedediah had cut himself the first summer they came to Kansas. She was thinking about the little attic where she stored the trunks that held her wedding dress and the baby clothes both children had outgrown. She was thinking about the axe leaning against the woodshed and the pile of new cottonwood down by the bend, where the storm had knocked 3 trees over in July. She was thinking about 12,000 pounds. She was thinking about a rope ladder. She was thinking about how many trips it would take to move 500 bushels one basket at a time up into the attic of a sod house with a ceiling 3 feet at the peak. She was thinking about Cyrus Blackwood on his black horse, about his gold watch chain, about his smile. By the time she came up over the rise and saw her own house sitting in the last gold light of September, with the smoke going straight up from the chimney because there was no wind, and Caleb feeding the mule in the yard, and Unia sitting on the porch with a rag doll in her lap singing something to herself, Elspeth Ellsworth had made a decision. She walked into her own yard. She set the little cloth bag from Ophelia on the porch rail. She knelt down in front of her daughter. Unia, Mama, do you know what we are going to do? What, Mama? We are going to sleep under gold, sweet pea. We are going to sleep under gold, and eat gold, and stay warm on gold all winter long. And that mean man is not going to get our farm. Unia thought about this. Are we going to be a princess? We are going to be something better. We are going to be alive. Caleb was standing by the porch step now. He had come up from the mule pen. He had heard. Mama. Yes. Are we going to do something? Yes. When? Elspeth stood up. She looked at her son. She looked at the barn full of corn. She looked at the sky. It would be dark in an hour. Tomorrow, Caleb. Tomorrow morning at first light. You and me. We start tomorrow. He nodded once. He turned. He went to put the mule in for the night. And Elspeth Ellsworth, 32 years old, widow, mother of 2, stood in her yard in the last light of a September evening in 1875, and looked up at the roof of her small sod house. Every inch of that roof was about to become the thing that saved her life. She just did not know yet how much it was going to cost her to put it there. First light. Elspeth stood in the middle of the main room, with an axe in her hand, and looked up at the ceiling of her own house like she was measuring it for a coffin. Caleb came in barefoot, hair sticking up in the back, still holding sleep in his eyes. Mama, are you tearing the house down? No. It looks like you are. I'm not. Then what? She lowered the axe. She looked at him. I'm building a barn, on top of us. Caleb blinked. Unia came in behind him, dragging the rag doll by one arm. What barn? You'll see. Where? Up. Unia looked up. She looked at the ceiling. She looked back at her mother. Mama, there is no barn up there. There will be. The first thing Elspeth did was empty the attic. Everything came down. Every trunk. Every crate. The old cradle Jedediah had built when Caleb was on the way. The wedding dress folded in tissue paper. 2 rolls of oilcloth. A broken churn. A box of nails Jedediah had bought in Topeka the summer before he got sick and never got around to using. She carried it all out to the barn. She stacked it in the empty corner where the plow used to sit. The plow was in the field. The corner was free. By noon the attic was bare. She climbed back up the little ladder in the corner, and she stood in the attic space and she looked at the joists. Cottonwood. Rough-hewn. Set 16 inches apart. Jedediah had cut them himself the first summer. He had been proud of them. He had said they would hold anything a Kansas roof could throw at them. Snow. Sod. Wind. He had never once said corn. 12,000 pounds. Elspeth stood there in the low space, and she did the arithmetic in her head one more time. Because she needed to be sure. Because if she was wrong, if the ceiling gave way in January, with all that grain on top of it, it would come down on her children in the night. 16 inches was too far apart. She would have to double it up. She would have to fit new poles between every existing joist. She would have to get the spacing down to 8 inches, maybe less. That meant new wood. That meant cutting new poles. That meant hauling them up from the creek. Alone. Well, not entirely alone. She climbed down the ladder. She went to the yard. She found Caleb by the pump. Caleb. Yes, ma'am. You are going to help me carry cottonwood. How much cottonwood? All of it. The storm-fallen trees at the bend in the creek were a mile from the house. There were 3 of them, 2 big ones and 1 smaller. Elspeth walked down there with the axe and the mule and Caleb and Unia in a little procession, and when they got to the trees she looked at them for a long moment and she thought, I am one woman. Then she thought, stop. Then she picked up the axe. She limbed the smaller tree first. Not because it was easier, because she needed to know if she could still swing an axe for an hour without her arms giving out. She had not done it since Jedediah got sick. 10 months. She could not. After 20 minutes her shoulders were burning. After 30 minutes her hands were slick, with sweat and starting to blister. After 45 minutes she had to sit down on the trunk of the tree and put her head between her knees because the sky had started to tilt. Caleb sat down next to her. He did not say anything. He handed her the tin cup of water Unia had been carrying. Elspeth drank. Then she stood up and picked up the axe. Because there was nobody coming. Because there was no husband walking up the road. Because the ceiling was not going to reinforce itself. She swung the axe. She kept swinging. She limbed the small tree by sundown. She dragged 1 pole home behind the mule, with Caleb walking beside the mule's head, and Unia riding on the pole itself, because she was tired and had been very brave. 1 pole. She needed 23 more. 3 weeks. That is how long it took. 3 weeks of walking down to the creek at first light. 3 weeks of the axe. 3 weeks of the mule pulling 1 cottonwood pole at a time up the rutted track to the house. 3 weeks of Caleb learning how to notch the ends of the poles with a hand hatchet, because his mother's hands could not do everything. 3 weeks of Unia in the yard braiding rag scraps into little pads that Elspeth could wrap around her palms, so the blisters did not open again. By the 2nd week Elspeth's hands were not hands anymore. They were something else. Something the color of raw meat. Something that had scabs on top of scabs. Something that trembled when she picked up a spoon. Miss Ophelia came up the creek path on the 5th day, with a small jar of bear grease, and a bundle of willow bark tied with twine. She did not knock. She just came in. She looked at Elspeth's hands. She sat down. She patted the kitchen chair across from her. Sit. Elspeth sat. Ophelia took Elspeth's left hand between her own 2 dark ones. Slowly, like the hand was made of glass. She turned it palm up. She looked at the mess of it. She sighed. Child, I know. You gonna lose your grip. I know. You gonna lose more than that if you don't let me tend to this. Elspeth did not answer. Ophelia was already reaching for the jar. The bear grease was cool. The willow bark, chewed to a paste in Ophelia's mouth first, because that was how her mother had done it, was warm and green-smelling. Ophelia worked it into the palms slow. She hummed under her breath. That old song. The one from the place Elspeth had never been. Elspeth closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 weeks somebody was taking care of her. She held it in. She had promised. When Ophelia was done she wrapped both hands in clean linen strips and tied them at the wrist. You leave these on tonight. In the morning you take them off. You use the grease again before you pick up the axe. Yes, ma'am. Ophelia stood up. She looked around the small kitchen. She looked at Unia on the floor braiding rag pads. She looked at Caleb outside the window, standing by the mule pen, with his father's old hatchet in his hand, notching poles like a small serious man. Elspeth Ellsworth. Yes, ma'am. You listen to me. Yes, ma'am. This is going to work. Elspeth looked up. You do not know that. I do know that. How? Because I have watched a lot of people get broken by a lot worse than a Kansas winter, and you are not going to be one of them. I have known that since the day you buried your husband and kept your face steady in front of your babies. Elspeth opened her mouth. She closed it. Ophelia went to the door. She stopped. She turned. One more thing. Yes. When you start hauling that corn up the ladder, you do not do it in 1 day. You do not do it in 2. You do it slow. A little every morning. A little every afternoon. Because if you tear something in your back doing this, no ceiling in Kansas is going to save you. She left. Elspeth sat at the table, with her bandaged hands in her lap for a long time. Then she got up, because the poles were not going to notch themselves, and Caleb had been out there alone, with a hatchet for an hour already. By the end of October the ceiling was ready. 23 new cottonwood poles, notched and fitted, and pegged between the original joists, so the spacing was now 8 inches instead of 16. Every gap in the wooden planks below was stuffed with rags and dried grass, so the grain would not sift down into the room. A new hatch in the corner, hinged with leather straps Elspeth had cut from an old harness. A rope ladder she had braided herself in the evenings by the fire. 3 strands of hemp twisted together, knotted every 18 inches for footing. The attic was ready. Now came the corn. Elspeth carried it up in a half-bushel basket. The basket was cedar. Jedediah had made it. It had a leather strap so she could sling it across her chest and still have her hands free to climb. 500 bushels. 1,000 trips. She did the first 100 in one day. It was a mistake. That night she could not lift her arms to unbutton her own dress. Caleb had to help her, 8 years old, undoing the buttons at the back of his mother's collar, with careful small fingers, because his mother's shoulders had locked up. She thought about Ophelia's voice saying slow. The next morning she did 50 trips. The morning after that, 50 more. She woke every day at 4. She lit the stove. She made cornmeal mush for the children. She started climbing at first light, and she stopped at noon. She made lunch. She rested for an hour. She climbed again from 2 until dark. Caleb filled the basket for her at the bottom of the ladder. Unia stood on a stool in the barn scooping corn into the basket with a wooden bowl because she wanted to help, and Elspeth had learned by now that when a 5-year-old wants to help you, let her, or she will find something worse to do with her afternoon. 50 trips in the morning. 50 in the afternoon. 100 a day. 10 days later the attic was full. Elspeth stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked up through the hatch. She could not see the roof anymore. She could only see gold. Gold packed tight from wall to wall, 2 feet thick, 800 cubic feet of dried kernels. A ceiling made of everything her family had grown that year. She climbed up one last time. She lay flat on top of the corn. She looked at the underside of the roof only a foot above her face. It smelled like autumn, like harvest, like the barn on the day of threshing, like her wedding day because Jedediah had smelled like this when they were courting, because he had been shucking corn at his father's place the day he first walked her home. She closed her eyes. She lay there, on top of 500 bushels of gold, under the roof of the house her husband had built. She thought, Jedediah, I did it. I don't know if I did it right, but I did it. She climbed down. She closed the hatch. That night, for the first time, since October had turned cold, she did not need to bank the fire before bed. The room stayed warm on its own. The heat from the stove rose up and hit the corn and stopped there. Trapped, held, refused permission to leave. Unia came and stood next to Elspeth by the stove in her nightdress. Mama, yes, it's warm. Yes, it's warm on the ceiling. Yes, it is. Is the corn keeping us warm? Yes, it is, sweet pea. Unia thought about this. Are we the corn's children now? Elspeth laughed. It was the first real laugh in a long time. Surprised her. It came out of her mouth before she could catch it. Maybe we are, honey. Maybe we are. November came, and so did Cyrus Blackwood. He rode up on the black horse on a cold gray morning, with the first thin skim of frost on the ground, and he did not dismount. Because Cyrus Blackwood did not dismount for widows. Elspeth was at the woodpile splitting kindling. She was not wearing a coat. She was wearing a light shawl over her calico dress. She was warm because she had come out of a warm house. Blackwood pulled up. He looked at her. He looked at the house. He frowned. Elspeth drove the axe into the chopping block. She wiped her palms on her apron. She looked up. Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Ellsworth. Something I can do for you. I was in the area. Were you? I thought I would check on you. How kind. Blackwood's eyes were moving. Slow. Careful. He was looking at the barn door. It was open. He could see inside. He could see the corner where the plow used to sit. He could see the trunks and the crates and the broken churn stacked there. He could not see any corn. He looked back at Elspeth, and that was when Unia came around the corner of the house. She was carrying a rag doll. She had a smear of cornmeal on her cheek from breakfast. She was 5 years old, and rosy and warm. She stopped when she saw the man on the horse. She did not smile. She moved behind her mother's skirt. She peered out. Blackwood looked at the child. Something crossed his face. It was there for less than a second. Then it was gone. He turned his eyes back to Elspeth. "The barn is empty," he said. "It is. Where is the corn, Mrs. Ellsworth?" "I sold it." The lie came out of her mouth clean and steady, and she did not blink. Blackwood's face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "To whom?" "A buyer." "Which buyer?" "A buyer from Kansas City. Passed through in October. Made a fair offer." "How fair?" 3 cents a bushel." Blackwood stared at her. She stared back. 3 cents. Less than his offer. Because if she told him 5, he would ask questions. Because if she told him 7, he would know she was lying. Because 3 cents was worse than his 4, and he needed to believe she had panicked, and he needed to believe she had sold low, and he needed to believe she was already broken. 3 cents, he said. 3 cents. You sold your entire crop for $15. I did. You could have had 20 from me. Your offer was in September. This was October. Prices dropped. Blackwood was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. Not the fake kind. A different kind. A satisfied kind. The kind of smile a man smiles when he thinks he has been proven right. "Well, Mrs. Ellsworth, that was a mistake." "Was it? $15 will not carry you through a Kansas winter. And it will not touch your bank note in April." "Perhaps not. When April comes and you cannot pay, when the sheriff nails the notice on the gate, you will remember that I offered you a fair price, and you refused it and then took worse from a stranger." "Perhaps I will." Blackwood tipped his hat. He glanced once more at the child behind her mother's skirt. Then he turned the horse. He rode away. Elspeth waited until he was over the rise. Then she picked up the axe and went back to splitting kindling. She was smiling. She could not help it. $15. $15 for 500 bushels. Let him believe it. Let him ride home believing it. Let him mark the auction date on his calendar in April and dream about how cheap he was going to get this land. Because when the wagons come back through in May and corn is 35 cents a bushel, this widow is going to sell 350 bushels of grain and walk into that bank and pay her note in full. And Cyrus Blackwood will find out. But not until April. The axe came down. The kindling split clean. The first storm came the second week of December. Came out of the north. Came fast. It came with a wind that made the cottonwoods bend, and the barn door bang, and the mule scream in the pen, because he could feel it in his bones before it hit. By nightfall the temperature had fallen 20 degrees. By midnight it was 5 below. By morning it was 15 below, and still dropping, and the snow had begun. The snow did not stop for 2 weeks. It piled against the north side of the house up past the window. It buried the fence. It buried the outhouse path, so deep that Elspeth had to dig it fresh every morning, with a shovel Caleb held for her. And inside the house, under the ceiling of gold, 3 people stayed alive. The stove burned less wood than it had in any November Elspeth could remember. She had cut wood all summer, expecting the usual winter, expecting to burn through the pile by February. She was burning half of what she had planned. The room stayed warm, not hot, but warm. Warm enough that Unia slept without her wool cap. Warm enough that Caleb could sit at the table and do his letters in the evening without his fingers going stiff. Warm enough that, when Elspeth woke in the morning, the water in the pitcher on the washstand was not frozen. She had lived in this house for 9 years. The water in the pitcher had always been frozen in December. Not this year. The neighbors were not so lucky. Word came in bits and pieces. From the boy who brought the mail once a week, when the road was passable. From the Reverend when he rode out to check on the outlying farms. From Miss Ophelia, who somehow always knew everything. The Petersons burned their barn in the second week of the storm. Not the whole barn, just the boards. They pulled the siding off one plank at a time, and burned it in the stove to keep the children warm. By the time the storm broke, they had a barn that was half a barn. The livestock had been moved into the house. 2 cows and a mule and 6 chickens, all in the front room with the family, because there was nowhere else warm enough to keep them. The Millers lost their youngest. He was 2. His name was Ezekiel. He caught the pneumonia in the second week, and by the third week he was gone. Elspeth heard about it from the Reverend. She sat down at the kitchen table when he told her, and she pressed both hands flat against the wood, and she did not speak for a long time. The Reverend drank her coffee. He was quiet with her. He understood. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and looked back into the warm room. Elspeth, it is very warm in here. Yes. How? Miss Ophelia taught me a thing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then Miss Ophelia is a blessing to this county. Yes, she is, Reverend. He put his hat on. He went out into the cold. Old Mrs. Hendricks died in the third week. She lived alone. She was 71. Her husband had been dead for a decade, and her sons had gone to Colorado in 73, and did not write often. She had a small sod house 3 miles east of Elspeth on a piece of played-out ground, where nothing grew right. When the snow finally broke, and the men could get through, they found her. She was sitting up in the rocking chair by the cold stove. Her Bible was open in her lap. She had a blanket around her shoulders. She had been dead for at least a week, they said, frozen solid. Her hands were folded on top of the open pages. She had marked her place with a piece of ribbon. The Reverend brought this news too. Elspeth listened. She stood by her stove. She looked down at the floorboards. Unia was under the table playing quietly with her rag doll. Caleb was reading by the window. The Reverend left. That night, after the children were in bed, Elspeth sat down in her own chair by her own stove, and something broke loose inside her without warning. Not because Mrs. Hendricks was dead. That was terrible, but that was not why. She wept because she was alive, because her children were alive, because Miss Ophelia had told her about a sealing 30 years ago in Georgia, and passed that knowledge down the creek to her, and because of that knowledge her babies were warm, and Mrs. Hendricks was frozen in a rocking chair. She wept because it was not fair. It was not fair that living or dying could come down to whether an old black woman had decided to trust you. She wept because she owed Ophelia something she could not name and could not pay. Then she stood up. She wiped her face. She went to bed. January. The middle of January was the coldest. 25 below for 6 days running. The wind never stopped. It came out of the north and it came out of the west, and sometimes it came out of both directions at once, in the way only Kansas wind can, and it drove the cold through every crack in every building on the prairie. On the 4th night of it, Elspeth heard something at the door. At first she thought it was the wind. It was always the wind. Then she thought it was an animal. A stray dog. A wolf pup lost from the pack. Then she heard it again, and this time it was a voice. A small voice. A voice that could barely make itself heard. Please, please, somebody. Elspeth was out of the chair before she thought about it. She threw open the door. A young woman was on the porch. She was wearing a shawl too thin. Her hair had come out of its pins. She had no bonnet. Her lips were the color of ash. She was very young, maybe 19. Elspeth did not know her. She was also very pregnant. Elspeth stared for 1 second. Then she grabbed the girl by both arms and pulled her into the house and slammed the door behind her. Sit there, by the stove, now. The girl tried to speak. Nothing came out. Do not talk. Sit. Caleb, wake up. Bring me the quilt off my bed. Unia, stay where you are. Caleb was already out of bed. He brought the quilt. Unia sat up wide-eyed, but did not move. Elspeth wrapped the girl in the quilt. She pushed her closer to the stove. She poured hot water from the kettle into a cup and added honey and pressed the cup into the girl's blue-white hands. Drink. Slow. The girl drank. She began to shake. That was good. Shaking meant the body was coming back. What is your name? Winifred Hollis. Where do you live, Winifred Hollis? 4 miles. East. My husband, Nathaniel. He fell off the horse 2 weeks ago. He is dead. Elspeth's stomach dropped. When are you due? They said February. How many weeks? 8 months. Maybe. Elspeth stared at her. Why did you walk here? No food. No wood left. I saw the smoke from your chimney yesterday. Thought. You walked 4 miles in this. I had to. Elspeth closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she opened them. Caleb. Yes, ma'am. Put your coat on. Take the lantern. Go find Miss Ophelia. Tell her to come. Tell her it is a baby. But the storm. Take the lantern. Go now. Follow the creek. You know the way. He was already reaching for his coat. He was 8 years old. His father would have said no. His father was not there. His mother was there. His mother said go. He went. Elspeth turned back to the girl by the stove. Winifred was staring at her. You are Elspeth Ellsworth. I am. I heard about you. What did you hear? They say your ceiling. Elspeth stopped moving. They say your ceiling is made of corn. Elspeth looked up at her ceiling, then back at the girl. Who told you that? People in town. Who else knows? Everyone. Elspeth sat down slowly on the chair across from Winifred Hollis. Everyone knew. Every man in the county who had watched his own crop rot in a bin nobody would buy from and then watched his children get sick from the cold. Every buyer who had circled her like a hawk. Everyone knew except Cyrus Blackwood. Because who in the county would tell Cyrus Blackwood a thing? Elspeth almost laughed. She caught it before it came out. Winifred. Yes, ma'am. You are going to have this baby in my house. I am sorry. Do not be sorry. I did not know where else. You came to the right place. Winifred began to cry. Silent. The tears just came. She was so tired. Elspeth reached across the table and took the girl's cold hand and held it. You are safe now, honey. You are safe now. The wind was screaming outside. The snow was piling against the door. Somewhere in the storm, an 8-year-old boy was walking 3 miles down a frozen creek with a lantern to fetch an old black woman who knew how to bring a baby into the world. And in the warm room under the ceiling of gold, 3 people were about to become 4. The baby came before dawn. Ophelia made it up the creek path, with Caleb walking ahead holding the lantern, and her hand on his shoulder for balance, because her hip was bad in the cold. She came through the door, with snow in her white hair under her bright headscarf, and she took one look at Winifred Hollis on the pallet Elspeth had made near the stove, and she started giving orders. Water on. Clean cloth. That kettle. Move that chair. Elspeth, wash your hands. Caleb, take your sister and go up in that attic and stay there. Caleb blinked. Up where? Up in the corn. There is a hatch in the corner. Go up and stay up. Sing to your sister. Do not come down until I call you. Caleb took Unia's hand. Unia was wide-eyed and quiet. He walked her over to the rope ladder. He climbed up first. He reached down and pulled his sister up after him. The hatch closed. Ophelia turned back to the woman on the pallet. Winifred Hollis. Look at me. Look right at me. You are going to be all right. This baby is coming. Winifred nodded. She could not speak. Elspeth knelt on the other side of the pallet. She held Winifred's hand. The girl gripped so hard Elspeth felt her bones grind together. The baby came at 5 in the morning. A girl. Very small. Too small. But she cried when Ophelia held her up. She cried loud. A furious little cry that filled the whole small room. Winifred started to cry too. Elspeth's eyes filled. She had not meant to let it happen. It just did. Because a baby had been born in her house on a night when everyone else was dying, and because the baby was crying, which meant the baby was alive. Ophelia was crying. Ophelia, who never cried. The three women sat there in the warm gold-lit room, with a newborn in a clean cloth, and none of them spoke for a long time. Then Winifred whispered, "Her name." "Yes, honey. I want to call her Hope." Elspeth nodded. She could not speak. Ophelia said it for both of them. "Hope Hollis. Welcome to Kansas, baby girl." Above them, from the attic full of corn, they could hear Caleb's voice. Small and low, singing his sister a song about lambs. The one their mother had taught them. The one Unia had sung the day her father was buried. Under the ceiling of gold, for women were now alive, who might not have been. And the winter was only half over. February, then March. The snow kept coming. The wind kept blowing. And under the golden roof of the small sod house, for women and 3 children stayed alive. Winifred healed slow. She had lost blood. She had walked 4 miles in a storm 8 months pregnant. Her body needed time. Elspeth gave it time. Winifred stayed on the pallet by the stove for 2 weeks, and then she moved to the little bed Caleb usually slept in, and Caleb slept on the floor by the stove without complaint because his mother had told him this was what a man did. Hope Hollis, tiny, furious, fed every 2 hours whether it was noon or midnight. She cried like a full-grown woman in a little body. Unia sat by the cradle Elspeth had brought back down out of the barn, and stared at Hope for hours, like the baby was a puzzle she was working on. "Mama, yes. Is Hope our sister now?" Elspeth thought about that. Kind of sweet pea. Kind of. April came slow. April did not want to come at all. The snow was still on the ground the first week. The second week it began to melt. The third week the roads turned to mud, so deep the wagons could not move. The supply trains from Missouri that were supposed to be through in March were still stuck somewhere east of St. Joseph, waiting for the roads to dry. The whole county was hungry. The general store in Prairie Grove had been out of flour since the 1st of April, out of coffee, out of sugar, out of everything a person could put in a pot and call food. People started eating things they would not have eaten in a normal year. Grass shoots, bark stripped off the young cottonwoods by the creek, the inner white part of pine cones. An old man 2 farms east ate a leather belt he had cut into strips and boiled for a day. He said it tasted like nothing, but it was something in his stomach that night. That was what mattered. Children started to look wrong. That was how the Reverend put it when he came through in the middle of April. He said the children were starting to look wrong. Their eyes too big in their faces. Their bellies swollen the way bellies get, when there is nothing in them for weeks. Elspeth listened to the Reverend, and she did not say anything, because her own children looked fine, because her own children were fine, because there was still gold in the ceiling. But her pantry was empty. The last of the flour was gone. The last of the salt pork was gone. The dried apples were gone. The potatoes had run out in February. She had been feeding 4 adults and 3 children out of that pantry for 2 months longer than the pantry was meant to feed anyone. She had one thing left. She climbed the rope ladder on the morning of April 15th. She pushed the hatch open. She looked at what was left of the golden roof. Still most of it. Still 400 bushels of kernels packed tight above her head. Dry. Clean. Untouched by mice because the packing was so tight the mice could not get in. She took down 2 full baskets. She climbed back down. She set the baskets on the kitchen floor. Winifred was nursing Hope in the rocking chair. Unia was on the floor next to her, patting the baby's foot. Caleb was at the table with a book. They all looked up. Elspeth put her hand on the corn. "All right," she said. "Now it feeds us." The hand mill was small. Jedediah had bought it their first year on the claim. 2 stones and a wooden crank. It sat on the corner of the kitchen table, and it turned corn into meal 1 slow handful at a time. Elspeth ground for an hour every morning. Her arms burned. Her shoulders burned. Her back burned. Everything on her body burned. But at the end of the hour there was cornmeal in the bowl. Enough for that day's food. Bread for breakfast. Mush for lunch. Pudding for supper, if there was still an ember of sugar left in the crock, which by the end of April there was not. Cornbread, corn mush, corn pudding, corn cakes, corn every way she could think of, for 6 weeks. Every meal, every day. Caleb never complained. Unia complained on the 3rd day, and then Elspeth sat her down, and explained that outside this house there were children, who had not eaten anything for a week, and Unia looked at her mother with her big serious eyes and thought about it, and then Unia said, "I like corn, Mama. I like corn very much." She did not complain again. Winifred wept the first time she was strong enough to help grind. Not from sorrow, from something else. She said, "In my house I would have been dead." She said, "My baby would have been dead." Elspeth did not answer. She just kept turning the crank. Miss Ophelia came up the path in the last week of April. Slow, leaning on a walking stick because her hip was worse in the wet. She had a small sack over her shoulder. She set the sack on the kitchen table. "What is that, Miss Ophelia?" "Dried apples. From my own storage. And a little honey." Elspeth looked at her. "You cannot spare that." "I already did. It's here now." "Miss Ophelia, do not argue with an old woman, child. The apples are for the baby's mother. The honey is for the little girl. My knees have decided that is how it is going to be." Elspeth did not argue. There were others who needed feeding. Elspeth knew it. She had known it since April started. She could feel it every time she looked out her own window and saw smoke from a chimney that should not have had smoke, because that family had run out of wood a month ago. She could feel it every time the wind carried the sound of a child crying, from the direction of the Fenton place 2 miles south. She sat by the stove one night, after the children were asleep, and she thought about it. Winifred was in the rocker, nursing Hope. The room was warm. The stove was low. The house smelled like corn. Elspeth spoke first. "Winifred." "Yes, I have been counting." "Counting what?" "Corn. Days. Mouths. And I have enough to feed us here until the wagons come." "Yes, and I have some over. Not much. Some." Winifred looked up. "You want to share?" "I have to." "Who?" "The Fentons, the Baumgartners, the little Kaufman children. That is at least 12 people." "I know. For how long?" "Until the wagons come." Winifred was quiet. Hope had fallen asleep at her breast. Winifred looked down at her daughter. She looked back at Elspeth. "Do you have enough for that?" "If I am careful, yes." "Will you have enough left over to sell in May?" Elspeth had been asking herself that same question for a week. "I do not know. You could keep it all." "I could. Nobody would blame you." "I would blame me." Winifred sat with that. Then she nodded once. Slow. "Then you take what you need, and I will help you carry it." The first delivery was to the Fenton place. Elspeth loaded the mule with 2 bushels of corn and a small crock of the dried apple mixture Ophelia had brought. She and Caleb walked the mule down the muddy road at first light. It took most of the morning because the road was still bad. Elias Fenton opened the door and stood there and did not speak. His wife Mary was behind him with a baby on her hip. The baby was thin. The baby did not cry. That was the wrong thing. Babies who are truly hungry stop crying after a while. They save the energy. Elias looked at the bushel baskets on the mule. He looked at Elspeth. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Elspeth spoke first. "It is corn, Elias. It will grind into meal. I have enough. This is for you." "Elspeth, do not. I cannot pay. Nobody asked you to pay. Take it inside. Your wife is going to grind some right now, and you are going to eat before I leave this yard." Elias Fenton stepped down off his porch. He walked to the mule. He put both his hands on the bushel basket, and he stood there. He did not lift it. He just stood there with his hands on the corn, and he put his forehead down on the basket, and he wept without a sound. Elspeth did not look. She looked at the sky. She looked at the mule's ear. She looked anywhere except at Elias Fenton, because a man in Kansas in 1876 did not want a woman to see him break. That was the rule. She knew the rule. She kept it. Caleb saw. Caleb was 8 and he saw. He walked over and put his small hand on Mr. Fenton's back. Just there. Just for a second. Then he walked back to his mother. They unloaded the corn into the Fenton pantry. Mary Fenton did grind some right then. She made cornbread. She put a piece in her baby's mouth, and the baby's eyes came back on. Just like that, Elspeth saw it. The eyes came back on. The light came back on. Elspeth walked home with Caleb and the empty mule, and she did not speak for a mile. Then she said, "Caleb." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you remember what you did back there?" "I put my hand on Mr. Fenton." "Do you know why?" He thought. "Because he was sad." "Yes." "Was that all right?" "That was exactly right." Caleb nodded. He kept walking. Elspeth thought, "Your father would be so proud of you." She did not say it out loud. She did not need to. They fed 5 families. They fed them for 6 weeks. By the middle of May, Elspeth had given away 150 bushels of corn, and eaten another 100, and there were 250 bushels left in the attic, and gold light still coming through the hatch every time she opened it. On the 17th of May, a wagon came through Prairie Grove. The first wagon from Missouri. The word ran up the road faster than any horse could carry it. A wagon at last. Loaded. Flour, coffee, salt, sugar, nails, cloth, everything the county had gone without for 2 months. And a buyer. The buyer's name was Meriwether Sloan. He was from Kansas City. He was fat and pink and had a soft voice and small clean hands. He set up in the back of the general store with a ledger and a scale and a bag of coin. He was paying 35 cents a bushel for corn. 35 cents. Nearly 9 times what Cyrus Blackwood had offered in September. Elspeth heard about it from the Reverend. She sat at her kitchen table. She listened. She nodded. She said thank you. She waited for the Reverend to leave. When he was gone, she went into the barn. She stood in the empty barn for a moment. Then she started loading the wagon. 350 bushels. Down from the attic, 1 basket at a time, in reverse of every trip she had made in October. Down instead of up. Out to the wagon Jedediah had built. Caleb helped. Winifred helped, carrying the baby in a sling across her chest. Even Unia carried a wooden bowl of kernels back and forth to add to the last basket. Took 3 days. On the 20th of May, Elspeth Ellsworth drove her wagon into Prairie Grove. She was wearing her best dress, which was not much, but it was clean. Her hair was pinned up. Caleb sat next to her on the seat. Unia sat between them. Winifred stayed home with Hope. The main street of Prairie Grove was busy for the first time since December. People had come from every farm in the county. They were lined up at the general store. They were talking. They were laughing. Not big laughs. Small laughs. The kind of laughs people make when they are remembering they are alive. Meriwether Sloan looked up when the Ellsworth wagon pulled in. He looked at the load in the back. He blinked. "Ma'am, is that all yours?" "It is." "How much?" 350 bushels. "Where did you keep it?" "In my attic." Sloan opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "Ma'am, corn stored in an attic all winter should be moldy. Come see." He climbed down. He walked to the wagon. He picked up a kernel. He rolled it between his fingers. He bit it. He looked at her. "This is as clean as any corn I have seen this year." "Yes." "How?" "Miss Ophelia Freeman." "Who?" "Never mind. Weigh it." He weighed it. It came to 348 bushels and change. He rounded up. He paid her 35 cents a bushel. $121.80. He counted it out into her hand. Gold coin and silver. Heavy in the palm. Elspeth Ellsworth stood in the main street of Prairie Grove on the 20th of May, 1876, with a fortune in her hand, and her 2 children beside her, and she did not smile. Not yet. Not there. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Sloane." She climbed back up on the wagon. She drove to the first bank of Prairie Grove. She walked in. She walked up to the counter. She set down $200 in gold and silver. She said, "The note on Jedediah Ellsworth's land. Please mark it paid in full." The cashier looked at her. He looked at the money. He looked back at her. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, Mrs. Ellsworth." And he wrote paid in full across the note in ink, and he stamped it and he handed it to her. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. She walked out. She got on the wagon. She drove home. Not until she was inside her own kitchen, with the door shut, and the children out in the yard playing, with Hope in the sling, and Winifred singing to the baby, did it come. She sat down at the table. She took the note out of her apron. She unfolded it. She read the words paid in full. And Elspeth Ellsworth, 32 years old, widow of Jedediah Ellsworth, put her head down on the kitchen table and let go of 14 months. She wept until the paper was wet. Then she folded it back up. Then she washed her face. Then she went outside and told her children they were going to have honey on their cornbread that night because there was a nickel of honey money left over after the taxes. Cyrus Blackwood came to see her in June. He did not ride up on the black horse this time. He rode a smaller horse, a brown one. The gold watch chain was still there, but the horse was different. She noticed. She was in the garden, hoeing weeds between the rows of new beans she had planted in May, with money from the corn. Her sunbonnet was pushed back on her head. Her hands were in the dirt. She heard the horse. She stood up. She wiped her palms on her apron. She turned. Blackwood did not dismount, but he did not sit tall in the saddle either. He sat kind of slumped, like the ride out had taken something out of him. "Mrs. Ellsworth." "Mr. Blackwood. I heard about the banknote." "Did you?" "I heard you paid it. In full. In cash." "I did. From the sale of corn." "Yes." "The corn you told me in November you had sold for $15. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the reins. He looked at the garden. He looked at the house. He looked back at her. "You lied to me." "I did." "Where was the corn?" "In the attic." "The whole time?" "The whole time." He closed his eyes. Elspeth waited. When he opened his eyes, they were different. Something in them had gone out. "May I dismount, Mrs. Ellsworth?" She looked at him. "You may." He swung down. Slowly. He did not have the ease he had in September. He came around the front of the horse, and he stood in her yard, and he took off his hat. Cyrus Blackwood took off his hat for a widow. Elspeth felt something move in her chest. She could not name it. She let it move. "Mrs. Ellsworth, I would like to tell you something. If you will hear it." "I will hear it." He took a breath. "In January, during the second storm, I was riding home from the Simpson place. I was 3 miles from town when the storm came down hard, faster than I expected. My horse went into a drift. I could not get him out. He broke a leg. I had to leave him." He paused. His voice was flat, like he was reading from a distance. "I walked. I do not remember how long. It was dark. I could not feel my feet. I saw a light. I walked toward it. It was the Peterson place." Elspeth did not move. They opened the door. They had almost nothing. They were burning the boards off their own barn to keep the children warm. I could see the barn from the yard half tore down. They had 1 pot of thin soup on the stove for 6 people. They pulled me in. They sat me by the fire. They gave me some of the soup. He stopped. He looked at the ground. I asked them why. I asked Mr. Peterson why he would give a stranger any of his food. Because he did not know me. It was dark. He could not see who I was at first. And by the time he did know it was me, he had already fed me. Blackwood's voice was rough now. Mr. Peterson said, "We heard about Mrs. Ellsworth. We heard she was still alive down the road. We heard how she was doing it. And we figured if she can stay alive, we can stay alive too. And if we are going to stay alive, then we are going to stay alive as people who took a man in during a storm. He looked up at her. Mrs. Ellsworth, I do not know why they said that. I did not deserve it. I would not have done it for them. I know, Elspeth said. But I sat by their fire, and I ate their soup. And I watched their oldest boy give up his blanket for me. A boy of 10. He gave a stranger his blanket. Blackwood put his hat back on his head slow. He reached inside his coat. He took out a leather pouch. He held it out to her. She took it. She opened it. Inside was every promissory note the First Bank of Prairie Grove had held on Jedediah Ellsworth's land. Every one. Not just the $200 note. The seed loan. The plow payment. All of them. Every one of them was marked paid. In fresh ink. In his own hand. Elspeth looked up at him. She could not speak. Blackwood said, "The $200 you paid the bank last month. That was the principal. There was interest still owed. Compound. From December. It would have come due next fall. It would have taken your land in the end anyway." "How much?" $41. "I did not know." "I did. I made sure you did not know. I had planned to send the notice in September." She stared at him. "I paid it," he said. "I paid the interest myself. Out of my own account. This morning." "Why?" "Because the Peterson boy gave me his blanket." Elspeth stood there in the middle of her garden, with a leather pouch full of paid notes, and dirt on her hands, and she did not know what to say. So she said the only thing she could think of. "Mr. Blackwood." "Yes. Thank you." "Do not thank me, Mrs. Ellsworth." "Why?" "Because I do not deserve to be thanked. I only deserve to have this done." He tipped his hat. He climbed back on the brown horse. He turned. He did not ride away in the slow, easy trot he had in September. He rode away like a man who had somewhere else he needed to be. And he did not look back. Elspeth stood in the garden for a long time. Winifred came out on the porch with Hope on her hip. "Elspeth." "Yes." "Who was that?" Elspeth looked down at the leather pouch. Then she looked up at Winifred. "That was somebody who used to be a bad man. I do not know what he is now." Miss Ophelia Freeman died in November of 1876. She died in her own bed, in the cabin with the golden ceiling. She had been slowing down since the summer. Her hip was worse. Her hands trembled when she poured. By October she needed the walking stick to get from the bed to the stove. Elspeth went every day to help her. Winifred and Hope had moved into Elspeth's house that spring and never moved out. Winifred cooked. Winifred helped with the garden. Winifred held Unia when Unia cried at night for reasons she could not explain, which was often because Unia had lost a father and had seen a baby born in a storm before she was 6 years old, and the weight of it came out sideways sometimes. Elspeth walked down to Miss Ophelia's every morning that November. She built up the fire. She made the bitter dark tea. She read from the Bible when Ophelia asked. She sat by the bed when Ophelia slept. On the night of the 14th of November, Ophelia opened her eyes and reached for Elspeth's hand. "Child." "Yes, ma'am." "You did it. You did it. I only listened." "That was the hard part." Elspeth held Ophelia's hand. It was very light, like a bird. "Miss Ophelia." "Yes. I do not know how to do this without you." "You will." "How?" Ophelia was quiet for a long time. So long Elspeth thought she had gone to sleep. Then she opened her eyes again. "Elspeth Ellsworth." "Yes. Knowledge dies when it is not passed on. That is how they really kill us. By letting us forget." "I know. You know it because I told you. Now who else knows it?" "Nobody yet." "Then you have work to do." "Yes, ma'am." "Promise me." "I promise." "Say the words." Elspeth said, "I will teach it. I will teach it to every woman in this county who will listen. I will teach it until I die, and I will teach my children to teach it after me." Ophelia closed her eyes. She smiled. "That is my mama's voice coming out of your mouth, child." She would be so pleased. She died an hour before dawn. Elspeth was holding her hand. The gold above them held its light. They buried Miss Ophelia by the creek, where the willow trees grew thick, where the water ran cool and clear, where she had first told a young widow about corn. Elspeth had a stone carved. It read, Ophelia Freeman. She taught me that the people who were called nothing knew what the people who were called something did not know how to learn. The Reverend read the words at the grave. He read them slow. He read them twice, because there were people from town at the funeral who had never spoken to Miss Ophelia when she was alive, and Elspeth wanted them to hear it. Twice. When the burial was done, the mourners walked back to the road. Elspeth stayed a moment longer. Caleb and Unia stayed with her. Winifred stood a few steps back, with hope in her arms. Elspeth knelt down. She put her hand on the fresh dirt. She said, quiet, so only Miss Ophelia could hear. I will teach it. Promise. Then she stood up. She took Unia's hand. She took Caleb's hand. Winifred fell in beside them with the baby. They walked home together. The 5 of them, a family made out of a Kansas winter. The following autumn, in September of 1877, Elspeth began to teach. She started with the widows. There were more widows than there used to be in that county. The winter of '75 had made them. Elspeth wrote each of them a letter. Not fancy, just a note. It said, if you have corn from your harvest and you have a ceiling, come to my house on the 2nd Saturday in September, and I will show you a thing. 7 women came. They stood in her yard on a warm September morning and looked up at her small sod house like they did not know what to expect. Some of them she knew. Some she had only heard of. Mrs. Baumgardner, Mrs. Fenton, whose husband Elias had died the summer before of a fever. 2 of the Kaufman women, a young widow named Ruth who had come from Ohio with a husband who did not last the year. Elspeth stood in her doorway. Caleb, 10 years old now, had built a new ladder that summer. Sturdier, wider treads. He stood by it, ready. Unia, 7, had a basket of dried corn on her hip. She had learned to braid corn husks the way Miss Ophelia had taught her. She was going to show the women how. Winifred stood on the porch holding little Hope, who was walking now and getting into everything. Elspeth spoke to the women. Ladies, come inside. I want to show you my ceiling. They came inside. They looked up. Above them was gold. 2 feet of it. New corn from the fall harvest, freshly hauled up, over the last 2 weeks by Elspeth and Caleb and Winifred. The room was already warm. The stove was low. The 7 women stood in the middle of Elspeth Ellsworth's kitchen, and they looked up at gold, and their mouths opened, and none of them spoke. Then Ruth from Ohio said, very quiet, Elspeth, out. And Elspeth said, sit down. I am going to tell you a story. It starts with a girl named Ophelia Freeman on a plantation in Georgia. And it ends with the reason my children are alive today. And when I am done telling you the story, I am going to show you how to build a ceiling like this in your own house. Every one of you, before the snow comes. The women sat down. Elspeth began to speak. Outside, the light through the window was the color of new wheat. Unia was showing Hope how to braid a corn husk. Caleb was checking the rope ladder to make sure the knots were tight. Winifred was pouring coffee, real coffee, from a kettle on the stove. And in the middle of the small warm room under the gold ceiling, a widow from Kansas passed on a thing that had been passed to her, from a black woman, who had been passed it by her mother, who had watched her daughter, from the back of a wagon in Macon, Georgia, and told her one thing, before the wagon took her away forever. Baby, when you know something that can save somebody, you tell them. You tell them before they ask. Use everything twice. Even the pain. The first pain teaches you to survive. The second pain teaches you to save somebody else. That is the thing Miss Ophelia knew. That is the thing Elspeth Ellsworth learned. That is the thing this story is trying to give to you.